Good morning, everyone. Someone once said we have to aspire to inspire before we expire. We have to aspire to inspire before we expire. You know, in this week's Torah portion, we have the story of Yitzchak. And one of the main stories of Yitzchak, there aren't that many stories about Isaac, but one of the main stories is this lengthy story about him digging wells. And what's interesting is that 2 weeks ago we read about Avram Avinu digging wells, and it says that he dug a well and the Philistines stuffed it up, and Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, made a peace treaty with him, and he named the well Be'er Shavah, the well upon which the oath, the promise, the peace treaty, the pact was made between him and Avimelech. Now in this week's Parsha, the Philistines stuff up the wells of his father. So Yitzchak comes and redigs the wells of his father. And what happens? They fight over it. So he names the first well Asek, because Asek means quarreling. Then they stuff up a second well. He redigs it again. And he names they fight about it, so he names the third well, the second well Sitna. Sitna means hatred, enmity. And then there's a third well they stuff up, and once again he redigs it, and this time they don't bother him, so he names it Rechovos, which means expansion. And then it says he digs a seventh well, and he names it Be'er Sheva, the seventh well. And the Torah says this is the city of Be'er Sheva till this very day in Israel. So what are all these stories with wells? So much discussion about the wells of Abraham, the wells of Isaac, and then next week Parsha we're going to read about Jacob meeting his wife at a well. What's this obsession with wells? Moshe meets his wife at a well, Eliezer finds Rivka at a well. And the answer is as follows. There's two sources of water in the world. There's the water that comes from above, from the heavens, and there's the water that comes from the well springs, from beneath the ground. Now you would think that the water from above would be the superior water, because after all it comes straight from heaven, and the water from the ground has to break through the rubble and the dirt and the filth in order to come out. Yet we all know that nothing quenches the thirst like well water. Why? Because well water is unpolluted. It's not tainted by the germs of the atmosphere. It's the purest, most refreshing, most quenching water. And the same thing, what does water represent? We know that water always represents Torah. Water represents wisdom. Water represents enlightenment. Water represents inspiration. And there are two forms of inspiration. One is the inspiration that comes from above. It comes in a straightforward manner. But then there's the water that we gain through the inner struggles and the inner the seeking within ourselves that can only break through the dirt and the rubble and the self-determination of revealing what we have deep within ourselves. And everyone knows that the wisdom we gain in life and the inspiration we gain from the waters that we had to dig for, that we had to seek out, that we had to break through the challenges of the rubble of the earth, the core, the shell of the earth, that's a much more refreshing and satisfying water than the waters that are just handed down to you straightforward from above. And that's the message of the wells. The message of the wells is that yes, God provides inspiration and direction, but the waters that we uncover within ourselves that are hard fought, those are the most satisfying and refreshing and quenching waters of all. Today's election day, and the beauty about a democracy is that it's not ultimately up to our leaders. Ultimately, we the people decide. It's the waters that come from below, from the groundswell, from the population that determines the ultimate direction and the course and the path of our society. And that's why it's so important that we all are active, and this is one of the most participated in elections. And as they say, all's well that ends well. When the wellspring comes forth from within ourselves, hopefully we'll get the right answer in the right direction for our country. I'll just conclude with a story. I tell a story about this artist, and he wanted to paint the most beautiful thing in the world. So he decided he's going to go on a journey. He said goodbye to his wife and kids. He went out looking for the most beautiful thing in the world to paint a portrait of. One day, he meets a bride on the way to a wedding canopy. And he says to her, "Tell me, what's the most beautiful thing in the world?" She said, "Well, of course, it's love." He said, "That's right, I want to paint a portrait of love." He's thinking, how do you paint love? He can't figure it out. So he keeps on journeying. One day he meets a soldier coming home from the battlefield. He said, "What's the most beautiful thing in the world?" The soldier says, "Peace." He says, "I'll paint a portrait of peace." But then he can't figure out, how do you paint peace? So he keeps on journeying, and he meets a rabbi on the way to the synagogue. And he stops the rabbi and says, what's the most beautiful thing in the world? And the rabbi says, faith. He says, I'll paint a portrait of faith. He can't figure out how to paint faith. So he's thinking love, peace, faith. Finally he gives up. After many months he decides to go home. He comes home to his home Friday afternoon. And he opens the door and his wife and kids come running. They hug him and they kiss him. And he says, this is the love that the bride told me about. Then he comes into his house and Shabbat begins. He feels the peace and the tranquility of his home. He says, this is the peace and the tranquility that the soldier talked about. And then he sits around the Shabbos table and he sings Shalom Aleichem and makes Kiddush with his family. And he says, this is the faith in God that the rabbi was talking about. And he decides to paint a portrait of his family sitting around the Shabbos table. And the message is, sometimes we travel far and wide seeking some inspiration from some far-off place. But the real inspiration in life comes within ourselves, within our own families. When we create the beauty within our own lives, that's the way we really find the inner well springs within our own neshama.